Thank you to Alliance Francaise, Hélène and Claude. I hope I'm worthy of your confidence in me. I have a certain amount of pride in being able to express my views to you and to speak to you on a subject I have been working on for a number of years, either as an author of books or as a commentator for my Radio France International, the radio appearance in part of programming for Radio France International French radio, which is broadcast throughout the world, for the most part in French, but also in other languages, English, for example. I speak in French. This subject, the United Nations, the organization of the United Nations, doesn't have the same place in the politics of the countries on one side of the Atlantic as it does on the other side. I would also like to make my apologies for my less than perfect English, which I haven't spoken 4 years, 10 years. I hope my accent, my French accent, my so typical French accent, my so delicious French accent will be such that you can understand me. Is there one vision of the UN on one side of the Atlantic, on a different one on the other? That's the subject of this discussion. It's a pleasure for me to speak about. I believe that there is indeed a difference, one that I will try to shed some light on. First, I think that it's important to mention that the nations of the planet apply different, even opposite sets of logic toward the United Nations. There, that of the United States, the most powerful country in the world today, certain of its strength, but still traumatized by the attacks of 2001. And ever since at war against terrorism. The US has been a country that, under the Bush administration, hasn't tried to trust the UN in terms of its foreign policy. Even if, during the second Bush administration, things have changed a little, but this opposition pushed to the limit showed and still show that the United Nations do not represent a priority for Washington. There, that as well of Europe, on its way to a slow integration, which continually makes mention of what's been called multilateral diplomacy, as represented by the UN. That's to say, diplomacy that is formed by the group, communally, with Germany, for example. Its foreign policy is practically a question of just one point of reference, because Europe still does not have a true foreign policy today. The decisions taken in Brussels in the matter come at each instance from a compromise among the 25 members in states, to which we must add now the 2 new arrivals since January 1, 27 now. But the harmonizations of the Union foreign policy is already a reality today. So, on the one side, you have the thinking characterized by what former French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hubert Védrine, has called American hyperpower. And the other side, Europe, thinking in progress, which says it takes the UN as a fundamental part of its external policy, if one can speak these days of an exterior policy. This is a term still uncertain for Europe, if only because of Great Britain, still closer to the United States than to the rest of the European continent when it comes down to making decisions in international matters. But Great Britain is an island set apart from the continent. We have to understand something. The UN, by virtue of its charter written in 1945, is for the, it's very important, collective security. Collective security. That's to say the collective resolution of conflicts and crises. Europe, made up of very different sovereign states, which for decades are learned to take position in common at the conclusion of long negotiations among its members, know what this means and play the game according to today's rule. Europe knows that from negotiations, always unsatisfying because they conclude in compromise, solutions arise from the most difficult and thorniest questions. This is most assuredly not the case for the United States, according to me, which represents one sovereign nation which does not wish to consult with any other nations before making decisions, especially when its strategic interests are at stake. America doesn't want to count on any nations other than itself. In the United Nations peacekeeping forces, for example, the United States only wants its troops commanded by Americans and not by officers from any other country. But in any case, the UN Blue Helmets don't have any American soldiers within their ranks. These two ways of thinking are at loggerheads within the different agencies of the United Nations, which make up what is referred to sometimes as the temper of the diplomacy. First, we'll take a look at how America regards the UN, what America's vision of the UN is, in my view. The American vision has evolved profoundly so. We must never forget that if the UN exists at all, it's in large part due to the efforts of a former President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. I'm not sure that all American politicians remember that. Just as one should never lose sight of the fact that the League of Nations, founded after World War I, was the initiative of one of the predecessors, Woodrow Wilson, two Democrats president. In each case, the American presidents put forward American ideas, especially in favor of freedom. A few months before the founding of the UN in 1945, President Roosevelt wrote, quote, "All the nations of the world must renounce in spirit the use of force. Future peace can only be lasting if land, sea, and air armaments continue to be used by nations who threaten or who can threaten to employ force." End quote. This sentence has an astonishing contemporary ring to it. It shows the idealism, was it sincere, which was prevalent during the founding of the United Nations, with designations which was preferable to Roosevelt over associated powers. The nations, that is, states and their people, thus had to unite in a sole organization, govern the affairs of the world, starting with, in particular, the Security Council, important too, specifically responsible for the affairs of peace and international security. The Security Council made up of the United States, but also Great Britain, Russia, China, and France. This initiative of Roosevelt's clearly showed that America was beginning to assert its leadership in the world after the horrors of World War II and after the American commitment against the Nazi and against the Imperial Japanese forces. As a Frenchman, I am aware of what we owe the Americans. The United States of Roosevelt and the Allies, except maybe the USSR, had to build at that time a new world order favoring peace. That term, New World Order, is not used casually or in some neutral way. It had been used by George Bush Sr. after the Gulf War. When you read the preamble of to the Charter, you consider both the beauty of the ideas expressed there and the distance remaining, fortunately for us, to go in order for us to attain them. Quote, for example, we, the peoples of the United Nations, resolve to preserve future generations from the curse of war, which twice in the time of a human life inflicted upon humanity indescribable suffering. End quote. Does it not speak, this text, of the fundamental rights of man, of the equality of rights for men and women, of justice, social progress, tolerance, economic progress, of non-use of weapons? Fundamentally, the United States of Roosevelt believed in the UN. It believed in peace after the horrors of World War. But everything changed with the coming of the Cold War, which wasn't all that cold, really, and the dangerous rivalry between Moscow and Washington. Harry Truman, Roosevelt's successor, no longer had as a priority collective security, but rather the battle against Soviet imperialism. That was the end of UN idealism. Realpolitik was now that the required vision. This political battle showed itself, for example, in the Security Council stalemate due to the use of the Soviet veto. The UN, an instrument of peace, had become the symbol of the Cold War. It's difficult to forget the UN debates during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, for example. Because of the Cold War, the UN was marginalized. The United States left it be so it could solve the world's great problems, with a few notable exceptions. In 1956, during the Suez Canal crisis, after intervention by the French and the British, President Eisenhower turned to the UN to chase the Europeans out of the canal zone, and the UN then funded its first Blue Helmet forces. In 1952, after the invasion in June of South Korea by North Korea, on June 27 of that year, the Security Council met and adopted a resolution which authorized the member states, quote, to come to the aid of South Korea with all military assistance needed to push back on armored attack in order to re-establish in the region international peace and security. How was it that in the middle of the Cold War, the Council was able to come to a decision without being broken by the antagonism between Moscow and Washington? Quite simply, because the policy of the USSR at the time was to absent itself from those discussions in order to obtain the admission of communist China to the Council. That allowed for the formation of a coalition formed for the most part by American troops, commanded until 1951 by General Douglas MacArthur and then by General Matthew Ridgway. The Korean troops were pushed back and a ceasefire was signed in 1953. It's very important to emphasize the fact that the UN had given the United States and 13 other countries the authorizations to go to war in a country for the purpose of liberating a country that had been invaded, as the Charter authorized them to do. Does that remind you of anything? As far as I'm concerned, it reminds me of the 1991 Gulf War. A few months after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Iraq situation was referred to the UN after the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein on August 2, 1980. On November 29 of that year, the Security Council voted for Resolution 678, which authorized the member states to use all the means necessary, or in other words, force, in order to push back the Iraqi dictator. We all know what happened next. What happened next, of course, was the war, officially conducted by a coalition of 28 nations, including France, but in reality led by the American army under the command of General Schwarzkopf, thus under American command. In January 1982, during a Security Council meeting with the chiefs of state attending, George Bush Sr., again, highly prized the UN, which allowed him to form and lead the coalition. President George Bush Sr. was a former representative of the United States in the Security Council. He knows the United Nations. This Gulf War and the Korean War has prompted the national observers to say that in accordance with the United States, the UN is an organization destined to form coalitions to defend the collective interest, certainly, but also its own interests. These same observers had remarked that in 2003, the United States wished to follow the same route, that is, to recreate a coalition against Saddam Hussein. But this time it didn't work that way. This was because of the opposition of the permanent member of the Security Council, France. And we all know the outcome. The coalition was formed, but without the support of the UN. The Secretary General Kofi Annan even considered this war to be illegal because it didn't have the backing of the UN. Now, we see that the United States mistrust of, without going so far as to say defense of, the UN as some saying that Washington wants more and more to turn to NATO for managing world affairs. In 1999, the war in Europe, in Kosovo, was carried on without the UN but with NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, under American directions, was founded in 1949 by the United States and 10 European countries to assure their mutual defense against the Soviet Union. Since then, the organization, which now has 26 members has, of course, changed its missions. According to Washington, it will be a good organization to assure the defense of Europe in its entirety. It could even be an organization with a worldwide job of maintaining peace, maintaining the peace. That's exactly the same missions of the UN's Blue Helmets. I add that since the 60s and the 70s, the United States has considered that the UN is an organization which is hostile to them. It's true that with decolonizations and the war in the Middle East, the United Nations has become a forum of anti-Americanism of quite a few nations. It's true. But it may be that American policy has also fanned the flames of the anti-Americanism, perhaps. The UN, in the minds of those in Congress and in the White House, both in the recent past and today, is a weak bureaucracy to which the affairs of the world can't be trusted. This characterization is obviously excessive. Surrounding the Secretary General are about 8,000 bureaucrats, which, all things considered, in my view, too, is not too many for managing the peace of the world. This reproach is not addressed toward the UN from the European Union. It's true that as far as bureaucracy goes, Brussels, where the European administration is headquartered, has no reason to be jealous of New York. Now let's look at the European vision of the UN. And to illustrate these visions, let's pause for a moment to consider the French vision of the UN. I think it summarizes that of Europe. At the moment, now, France, in my view, is the United Nations star pupil. This has not always been the case. The countries support the UN because the UN extends France's vision of the world, a French diplomat told me one day. The UN extends France's vision of the world. It's important to have this spirit. What's more, with its veto, France has at its disposal, as does the United States, a genuine diplomatic privilege. That is a distinction in Europe that France shares only with Great Britain. Previously, relations between the UN and France had been tense. During the 50s and the 60s, the period of decolonization again created tension. An example of this was when the General Assembly recognized, quote, the Algerian people's right to self-determination. At the time, President Charles de Gaulle would have called the UN in French a machin. That is a poorly conceived invention that serves no great purpose. It was after the Cold War that France began supporting the UN. In 1993, for example, France was the first provider of troops to the organization. Today, France is interested in setting all international crises while sitting at the Security Council table. The French account for around 6% of the UN staff. French military personnel in particular are represented in the peacekeeping missions. In theory, France has at the disposal of the UN 5,000 men who can be deployed in 8 to 30 days, in theory. French goodwill is thus remarkable. It stands in contrast with American distrust. These two positions came to light during the diplomatic crisis of 2003. France wanted to play the UN card all the way, wishing to continue the inspections intended to detect the eventual existence of arms of massive destruction, which in fact did not exist. Why the United States, you know, wanted to go to war against Saddam Hussein at any cost. What is the situation for Europe as a whole? What is Europe's position in relation to the UN? This is then the second point to be discussed here. When I speak of Europe, I'm speaking obviously of the European Union, which today includes countries from the west and from the east of the whole continent. I'm obviously not talking about Russia. The UN has been important for Europe since 1993. Why that year? Because that was the year of the Treaty of Maastricht went into effect, which envisioned for the European Union a, quote, common foreign and security policy. Paragraph 4 of the treaty provides that Europe must do everything within its power to develop a policy favoring the maintenance of peace and the reinforcement of international security. Another treaty, the Treaty of Amsterdam, again in the city of Netherlands, which is from 1999, reinforced this goal. This text created, for example, the position of High Representative for Common Policy and Security of Europe. As you can see, since the end of the Cold War, the European Union has been going toward finding and establishing a foreign policy. This could have gone further. Still, it's a proposed European Constitution rejected by France and the Netherlands in 2005 had been put into law. For example, Title 5 of this text evoked exterior action of the Union, quote, it provides that the European Union should preserve the peace, anticipate conflicts, and ensure international security in conformance with the goals and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. It also states that the member states who are members of the Security Council will defend while exercising their functions the position and interest of the Union. Sorry, that's a little technical, but we have to be precise. And since 1999, the European Union effort has also focused on defense. It's more and more a question of common defense policy. In concrete terms, that means that for the past 10 years, Europe has intervened in conflicts not to wage war, but to maintain the peace, as was the case in the Balkans. For example, what we must take note of is that the European Union intervenes not only under the mandate of the United Nations, but also to support the UN, in particular in Africa. France intervened for several months in Ituri, in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, in place of the Blue Helmets. Europe also aided the UN there last year during elections that were held in that vast African country, and rich African country. The European Union and the UN now work hand in the hand in certain situations. There is then a European foreign policy being formed, even if Europe isn't ready to speak with one voice. We should add, as regards Europe-UN relations, some important informations. The European Union represents 27 nations out of 192 in the UN, which therefore gives it 27 voices, whereas the United States had one voice. What's more, the European Union is represented by 2 member states, which are permanent members of the Security Council, we have said, France and Great Britain. And there are 2 countries, therefore, that have the power of the veto. The European Union overall represents 25% of the global GNP, has more than 450 million inhabitants, and contributes half of the budget for development aid. That is not insignificant. It's very important. Within the UN itself, the European Union represents 40% of the financing of the standard budget. 40%, a little less than half of the working budget of the peacekeeping operations, and half of the financing of different UN programs. I've provided you with these figures to show you that the European Union weighs in a big way, both on the world scene and within the UN, more so even than the United States, except militarily. The Europe of today, then, as well is at once an important presence in the UN and represents a willingness to develop a vision of the world with the UN as a starting point. Today, for Europe, according to me, as a journalist, the question is no longer whether the UN is useful and important, but how Europe can make itself heard there more effectively. You must know, then, that a European Parliament resolutions request that the European Union have a seat in the General Assembly and on the Security Council at the side of France and Great Britain. I'm not sure that the United States would accept such a reform, which in any case wasn't considered in 2005 at the moment of the General Assembly for the 60th years of meeting, when 60 years anniversary, when reform of the organization was being envisioned. This reform was just not discussed, even if, in consideration of its weight within the organization, Europe, which has made such a strong case for the UN, should have a greater role to play. In other times, it must be noted that the USSR was represented at the UN as well as 2 states, which it then totally controlled, Belarus and Ukraine. In any case, no one, especially in London or Paris, contemplates the possibility of either the United Kingdom or France ceding their seat of the Council in favor of the European Union. Before really having common foreign policy, the question for the European Union is also to find out how to make itself heard with a single voice, how to bring the different foreign policies of the different member states of the UN into line. As a general rule within the UN, the member states of the European Union speak in the name of their own country as well as in the name of the Union, we have said. That's to say that the different ministers of foreign affairs all keep their points of view in tune with each other as regards the great questions affecting the world. But the question of Iraq, the diplomatic crisis of 2003 showed that Europe could be divided too. there was a fracture point between the new member states of the East and the others. This fracture point was between old Europe, to use the non-Rumsfeld term, and the new Europe. Even within the Security Council, there was a break between Paris and London. This at the same time that Germany had a seat there as a non-permanent member, was close to the opinion of France. For the moment, Europe is a political structure which is closely linked to the UN, but while waiting for a potential common foreign policy, it's not immune to the development of new divisions. And those will be divisions which could, on some other occasion, be expressed within the United Nations. The time has come for some concluding remarks. In 2002, an American author, Robert Kagan, speculated that the United States constitute a power coming from Mars, the god of war. And Europe, the weaker one, is closer to Venus, that gentle celestial body. A year later, a European author, Zvetan Todorov, wrote that Europe is a quiet power. Military power or quiet power, I leave it to the experts on American and European question to decide. As far as the two versions of the UN are concerned, according to whether you are on one side of the Atlantic or the other, one thing is clear. The thing that the two sides reflect is nothing more than, finally, two different visions of the world. For the United States, the world stands in the current administration. This vision is very accentuated, but it's nothing new. The world tends to be unipolar. It's often the case that for American presidents and American members of Congress, the world is America. We are really in a very big country, even here in Atlanta. What counts is what's going on in Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, New York, and more simply, in the state of Georgia, and even in the counties. The size and the strength of your country are such that the rest of the world, poorly understood and often unknown, is far away. America is the world. As far as Europe is concerned, on the contrary, everybody, or nearly everybody, has understood that the world is multipolar, is formed by the 192 states of United Nations. As globalizations began to be a stronger and stronger force, Europe realized it had to build itself up. Each nation having to become open to the other. I'm thinking, for example, about France with Germany, two countries that have become more and more integrated, closer and closer to each other. The euro is a symbol of this opening up. L'union fait la force. We say in France, union is strength. Europe has also understood that the affairs of the world are, of course, decided in the United States, especially economic matters. But they're decided too in China and Japan. Europe has watched India and Brazil emerge, two countries which, moreover, will be called upon one day to play a greater role within the United Nations. And then Europe, near Africa, knows what aid for development is, aid to the most severely disinherited of the planet. Europe understands, as you do, what illegal immigration is, what is for them to be willing to submit to every kind of danger in order to find refuge in a new land. Some come, for example, through Spain or by way of Italy. These are two visions that find themselves in opposition today. This is true in particular within the UN itself. And since Europe multipolar visions is the closest to the UN Charter's goals, closest to the UN's missions and its visions, Europe is without doubt today the part of the world that is closest in this respect to the United Nations. That does not mean that Europe is being naive and has forgotten realpolitik. Europe knows that nations are called heurted monsters, des monstres froids in French, as we say in France, monstre froid, called heurted monster, selfishness. Today, the United States must become more unified with Europe as concerns the UN. American politicians must come to understand once and for all that the UN, imperfect, very imperfect as it is not a threat to their country, but perhaps a way to manage this world without borders while taking into account the other countries of the planet. In my view, they must, in other words, rediscover Roosevelt's ideas. I thank you for your attentions, and I thank you again for Alliance Francaise for having invited me. Thank you. And for the questions, I hope you have questions. I have a translator, two translators. It's more easy for me to speak in French to answer to your questions on the subject of United Nations. En
français? No, I could in English, but I don't know. That's easier.
In English.
In English, okay. I'm like you, my English is not perfect, but we'll do as best as we can both. No, I'm a bit worried about, you make so much emphasis on Iraq, which I do understand why. But right now I hear so much. You mentioned to them Africa. For me, Africa is a big issue. And we hear a lot about Darfur, okay? So what's a lot of criticism of what? So I would like you to talk very briefly. For me, that's one of the big issues in Africa.
Alors, contrairement à ce qui s'est passé avec le Rwanda, les Nations Unies ont décidé d'intervenir et ont fini par voter au mois de juillet une résolution qui autorise une force multinationale à se déployer au Darfour, ce qui veut dire que les
United Nations agreed to send some forces and to adopt a resolution to send some forces in Rwanda.
To Darfour. Ce qui veut dire que la Chine, à l'issue des discussions, a autorisé, la Chine qui soutient le régime soudanais, a autorisé ce vote.
Which means that China authorized this vote.
Alors, il y a deux façons de voir les choses. Soit on se dit, l'ONU, une fois de plus, a mis des mois, alors que peut-être le génocide est effectif.
So there's two ways of seeing things. We can say on one side that the United Nations took months to take a decision while the genocide had started already.
Et la deuxième vision qui est de dire, plus optimiste, qui est de dire que, en fait, les Nations Unies ont décidé quelque chose.
Or the positive view to say, well, at least the United Nations decided on something.
Mais il y a une chose importante que j'explique souvent en France, même aux auditeurs de Radio France Internationale, c'est que l'ONU, ce n'est pas un gouvernement mondial.
So one important thing that I often explain on RFI is that the United Nations is not a government organization.
C'est un outil qui est aux mains des États et c'est le reflet, l'ONU, des différentes relations entre les États et des rapports de force.
It's a tool for all those different states and it reflects the difficulty to work together.
Si l'ONU n'intervient pas, il faut toujours se demander pourquoi les États qui sont derrière ne veulent pas intervenir.
If the United Nations are not taking any actions, then we have to wonder why the states that are behind the United Nations are not trying to make something.
L'ONU a plein de défauts que j'ai constatés, c'est un autre sujet, une bureaucratie, un problème de compétences.
The United Nations has a lot of flaws, like bureaucracy and
Incompétence de certains.
incompetence from certain people.
Mais c'est quand même un instrument qui permet d'avoir une politique commune.
But it's a tool that allows to have a common policy.
Si les États ont intérêt à l'utiliser.
If the different states have interest in using it.
Et critiquer l'ONU, c'est très facile. Je le fais aussi.
It's really easy to criticize the United Nations. I do it myself.
Mais il faut regarder ce qu'il y a derrière le Conseil de sécurité et ce que veulent les États.
But you also have to look at the other side of the United Nations and what the different states really want.
Je suis dans une radio qui s'intéresse beaucoup à l'Afrique et la question qu'on se pose depuis, c'est une question d'histoire maintenant, pourquoi les États n'ont pas voulu intervenir au Rwanda? Il ne faut pas dire pourquoi l'ONU n'est pas intervenue au Rwanda, il faut se demander pourquoi les 5 États membres permanents du Conseil de sécurité, à part la France qui a organisé sa propre opération, pourquoi ces États n'ont pas voulu intervenir?
So in RFI we often wonder why none of the states decided to do something in Rwanda. Besides France, who did something on his own, none of the states got together to do something.
Et donc, il faut toujours, quand on parle des Nations Unies, aller au-delà des Nations Unies et regarder ce que veulent les États qui sont derrière. C'est ça qui est extrêmement...
When you talk of the United Nations, you really have to look beyond the United Nations and try to understand what each different state really wants.
Et alors, on comprend mieux dans ce contexte pourquoi, quelquefois, les diplomates des différents pays mettent des mois avant de voter une résolution alors qu'il y a un génocide ou une tuerie de masse. Parce que la définition du génocide est une définition très précise, en tout cas de beaucoup de morts. Il y a le temps des... Ouais.
So it's more easy to understand why sometimes it takes a lot of time for a decision to be taken, even when a genocide has started and there's a need of emergency.
Et plusieurs fois, en tant que journaliste à New York, comme les autres journalistes, on regardait CNN pour des crises, la guerre du Golfe, etc. Et on demandait aux diplomates, alors qu'est-ce que vous allez faire? Comment ça marche, etc. Et les diplomates disaient, il y a le temps de CNN, il y a le temps de diplomates.
So very often when I was in New York, we were watching the news on CNN, and then when the diplomats would come out, we would ask them, so what are you going to do about it? And they would answer, well, there is a time for CNN, and there is a time for diplomats.
Et pour le Rwanda, il y avait les premières images du génocide des Tutsis sur les écrans de télévision. Les diplomates voyaient les images, mais malgré ces images, ils ne sont pas intervenus, les représentants des États. Je ne veux pas être le défenseur des Nations Unies, je ne suis pas le représentant des Nations Unies, mais quelquefois je me dis, c'est pas très juste de critiquer l'ONU, comme si l'ONU était une entité indépendante.
So when the genocide started in Rwanda, the diplomats could watch TV, they could see what was happening, but they were not doing anything. So it's sometimes easy to criticize the
tel point que le président Clinton a présenté ses excuses.
And Clinton had to apologize for that.
Après. Et les Nations Unies aussi, d'ailleurs. Donc, le Darfour, il y a en quelque sorte un progrès, parce que les diplomates sont arrivés à une résolution. Alors après, il faut savoir si... Mais ça, c'est aussi un autre sujet. Une fois que la résolution est votée, qui décide de déployer une force, il faut trouver les casques bleus.
So for Darfur, they came up to an agreement, so it is progressing. But now we have to see what will happen after the agreement and when will the forces be sent.
Il faut... ce qui est intéressant à l'ONU, une des choses qui m'intéresse le plus en tant que journaliste, c'est qu'il y a d'un côté un idéal et de l'autre côté la géopolitique.
So what really interesting and what I really find interesting is that for the UN, on one side you have the ideal, then on the other side you have geopolitics.
Et depuis la fin de la guerre froide, l'ONU a commencé, la vraie naissance des Nations Unies, en fait, c'est 1990 avec la guerre du Golfe.
So since the Cold War, the United Nations started to...
Je veux dire que...
reborn. But the real birth was...
Et depuis la fin de la guerre froide, il y a cette lutte entre l'idéal des Nations Unies et les intérêts des États.
And from the end of the Cold War, there is this fight between the ideal of the organization and the interests of the different states.
Mais il faut se demander si... je suis persuadé que c'est maintenant qu'on a besoin d'une organisation internationale comme les Nations Unies, qu'il faut changer, qu'il faut réformer, bien sûr. Mais c'est maintenant qu'on a besoin d'une organisation internationale, dans la globalisation. C'est évident pour les problèmes de l'environnement, pour les problèmes politiques à l'échelle de la planète.
So I personally think that it is now that we do need such an organization as the United Nations.
Et il y a une chose aussi que je voudrais ajouter, c'est que en tant que journaliste, il me semble important il me semble qu'il commence à naître ce qu'on appelle une opinion publique du monde mondial.
So as a journalist, I think it's important to say that there seems to be a general opinion about the world.
Et ça pourrait aider en fait les Nations Unies d'avoir cette opinion publique mondiale.
C'est-à-dire que it would really benefit to the United Nations to have this general opinion.
Et je crois qu'il faut changer beaucoup de choses. Ça, c'est pas le thème de la conférence, mais il faut changer le Conseil de sécurité, il faut donner plus de moyens, il faut...
There are many things to be changed. We need to give them more means, probably.
C'est vrai qu'il y a beaucoup d'États qui ne sont pas des démocraties aux Nations Unies, c'est vrai. Ils ont la même voix, je ne sais pas moi, un régime tyrannique a la même voix que les États-Unis, par exemple.
There are many states that are not a democracy, but still count as one vote in the United Nations. Vous avez une question?
I like very much your presentation. I find it remarkable that you have gone that far in the lecture on the United Nations to an American audience and haven't yet pronounced the word Islam. Je trouve remarquable que vous soyez allé tellement loin dans une présentation des Nations Unies à l'urgence américaine sans prononcer le mot Islam. I'm saying this because you've got to realize that for lots of Americans, there is an evil empire, a new one, called Islam, which may be even more evil than the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union at least had one centralized government, one center of decision, one army, and you could talk with it. Whereas Islam has no shape. You see, in their eyes, the evil empire that America is united has no specific
sais pas comment répondre à cette question. Si vous dites l'islam aux Nations Unies, on va vous répondre ça ne veut rien dire parce que nous, on ne reconnaît que des États. Alors, est-ce que c'est un État musulman ou est-ce que c'est un État chrétien, un État juif c'est la notion d'État qui, d'autre part, qui prévaut aux Nations Unies.
So I don't really know how to answer this question because if you say the word Islam in the United Nations, then it doesn't recall to states.
Et je fais la différence aussi entre un État comme, je sais pas, l'Indonésie, et puis qui est musulman, et puis un État comme le Pakistan.
I make a big difference between Indonesia, who is a Muslim state, and the Pakistan.
Mais que l'islamisme soit l'islamisme, c'est-à-dire les fondamentalistes, soit un problème, oui. Mais aux Nations Unies, on va pas vous dire que le fondamentalisme est un problème. On va vous dire que l'Arabie Saoudite est un problème.
So in the United Nations, you will not hear that the fundamentalism Islamic is a problem. You will hear that Saudi Arabia is a problem.
Right?
But that's exactly the problem then, right? 60 years ago, there were individual states and countries that were problems, right? And I think some of the UN or the U.S. view of the UN is that right now that is not adequate anymore because individual countries are not necessarily the problem, but people in those countries, terrorists. So does the U.S. or does the UN even have the means to fight that kind of new problem? You know, from a U.S. perspective, you probably don't.
Le problème aujourd'hui, c'est que justement, c'est plus des États qui posent problème, mais des gens, des terroristes à l'intérieur de différents pays. Est-ce que les Nations Unies se rendent compte de ce problème?
Mais moi, je ne suis pas le représentant des Nations Unies, je ne suis pas le porte-parole, mais quand il y a eu, quelques jours après les attaques du 11 septembre, l'ONU, pour la première fois de son histoire, a voté des résolutions autorisant les États-Unis, un pays donc nommément cité, à faire la guerre contre le terrorisme.
So I'm not a representative of the United Nations, but after the September 11th, the United Nations authorized the United States, one country,
De combattre le terrorisme.
to fight terrorism.
C'est la première fois que l'ONU autorise un État à mener une guerre, non pas parce qu'un pays a été envahi, par exemple, parce que l'ONU reconnaît la légitime défense, mais autorise un État à mener une guerre, non pas contre un pays, mais contre un thème, le terrorisme.
So it was the first time that the United Nations allowed a country to fight not another country, but a theme, like the terrorism.
Alors, mais d'évidence, les Nations Unies ne sont pas faites pour lutter contre le terrorisme, c'est vrai, évidemment.
But it's clear that the United Nations is not made to fight against terrorism.
Il n'y a pas d'armée, c'est pas le but.
It's not the goal of the United Nations.
Et c'est peut-être pour ça, c'est peut-être une des sources des tensions entre les États-Unis et les Nations Unies d'ailleurs.
And maybe that's where the problem came from between the United States and the United Nations, where different point of views started.
Peut-être que le Conseil de sécurité, dans les mois qui viennent, va autoriser les États-Unis, la France et d'autres pays à entrer en guerre contre l'Iran.
Maybe that the Security Council will allow in a few weeks or in a few months the United States or France or countries in Europe to go and fight against Iran.
Ça sera peut-être dans le cadre de la lutte contre le terrorisme, mais l'ONU votera cette résolution uniquement comme une guerre contre un État.
It might be in this frame of fighting against the terrorism, but it will be going to war against one country. Any other questions? Oui?
Mais je voudrais revenir sur la question que vous posiez sur le poids de l'islam, qui était une question importante. Moi, j'ai entendu beaucoup de commentateurs en France.
So I wanted to come back on
Your
your
question.
question about Islam. I've heard many journalists in France
Entendu que la France n'a pas voulu aller en Irak parce qu'il y a en France une importante communauté musulmane.
I've heard that France didn't want to go in war against Iraq because there was a big community, Muslim community in France.
Peut-être que ça a été une des raisons qui ont fait que la France n'est pas partie en guerre en Irak. Peut-être.
Maybe it was one of the reasons why France decided not to go in war against Iraq.
Une des raisons. Hein.
Il y avait une question.
Does the personality of the president of the UNO have an impact on the organization?
Does the personality of the president of the United Nations has an impact on the decisions?
C'est une très bonne question parce que en fait le secrétaire général n'a pas de pouvoir. C'est pas un président, hein, même s'il a un rang de président.
So the general secretary doesn't have any power. It's not a president.
Le seul pouvoir du secrétaire général, c'est qu'il peut saisir le Conseil de sécurité d'une question.
The only power he has is that he can seize the council with a question.
Le Conseil de sécurité d'une question comme un État le fait.
As a state can do it.
Et le poste de secrétaire général repose exclusivement sur la personnalité du secrétaire général.
And it's a lot to do with his own personality, the power that he will have.
Si le secrétaire général veut être vraiment le secrétaire général de l'ONU, c'est-à-dire qu'il doit s'opposer à tous les pays.
If the General Secretary of the United Nations wants to do his job, means he has to go against all the countries.
Et des secrétaires généraux, si Kofi Annan, par exemple, a été élu secrétaire général de l'ONU,
If Kofi Annan was elected General Secretary of the United Nations,
c'est parce que les États-Unis s'étaient opposés à la réélection de son prédécesseur, Boutros Ghali.
it's because the United States were against the re-election of the former General Secretary.
Boutros Ghali, un Égyptien. Et si les États-Unis n'ont pas voulu réélire Boutros Ghali, c'est que Boutros Ghali s'était opposé aux États-Unis.
If they didn't want to re-elect him, it was because he went against the United States.
Et Madame Albright, c'est ce qu'on disait ce matin, qui était secrétaire générale, secrétaire d'État, avait dit à l'époque, parce que Boutros Ghali avait une forte personnalité, elle avait dit, Monsieur Boutros Ghali, un secrétaire général, ça doit être plus un secrétaire qu'un général.
Mrs. Albright said to Mr. Boutros Ghali, a general secretary should be more a secretary than a general.
Et ça explique bien que les secrétaires généraux doivent savoir s'imposer face aux chefs d'État, tous les chefs d'État, États-Unis et les autres. Et c'est une mission quasi impossible.
So it explains well that a general secretary has to impose himself very strongly.
Alors il y a la personnalité et plus que tout, il y a les qualités morales et l'honnêteté.
So it's not only his personality, but it's moral quality and his honesty that counts a lot.
Et comme on dit en français, mais ça ne va pas le traduire, la femme de César doit être irréprochable, mais c'est un peu ça, c'est l'affaire pétrole contre nourriture a entaché la fin du mandat de Kofi Annan.
The story of petrol against food made a bad impact on Kofi Annan.
Et c'est amusant parce que il y a une tendance chez les secrétaires généraux de l'ONU à finir par se prendre un peu pour des chefs d'État, c'est vrai.
There's a tendency with the General Secretary of the UN to think they are
Et au moment de la guerre du Vietnam, un autre secrétaire d'État dans les années 60, américain, qui s'appelait Dean Rusk,
During the Vietnam War, Dean Rusk
avait dit au secrétaire général de l'époque, je ne sais plus comment, c'était Utah ou quelque chose, oui c'était Utah, avait dit au secrétaire général de l'époque, mais qui vous êtes vous? Un pays?
told the general secretary of the time, but who
No.
are you?
Dean Rusk, l'américain, avait dit au secrétaire général qui voulait se mêler de faire la paix au
Okay, so
Vietnam,
Dean Rusk
qui
said
vous
to
êtes?
the general secretary, but who are you? A country?
Donc il faut que les secrétaires généraux s'imposent. Alors pour l'actuel, M. Ban Ki-moon, c'est trop tôt encore, je crois, pour se faire une opinion, mais il est quand même le secrétaire général qui a réussi à faire voter, parce que c'est aussi grâce à lui, la résolution sur le Darfour.
So for the actual general secretary,
Ban Ki-moon,
it's too early to judge whether he'll do good or not. But he is the one who made it happen for the resolution to be voted for the Darfour.
Il y a aussi des secrétaires généraux qui ont travaillé avec les États-Unis, mais de façon un peu clandestine. Le premier secrétaire général de l'ONU, qui s'appelait Trim Veli, c'est un Birman, travaillait avec le FBI pour surveiller le secrétariat, son administration, voir s'il n'y avait pas des espions communistes à l'intérieur.
So there's also several general secretaries who work close with the United States, and one of them had someone from the FBI working with him to make sure that there was no communist spies in the team.
Donc la personnalité, le caractère et l'indépendance et l'honnêteté du secrétaire général, c'est la qualité qu'il doit avoir, parce qu'il n'a pas de pouvoir, c'est une autorité morale. On dit, moi dans un de mes livres, je dis que c'est une sorte de pape laïque.
It's a moral authority, the role that he has. His personality, his honesty, his moral rules is the only power that they have. So I call him a laïc pape pope. Secular pope.
Je travaille pour mon beau-père. Il voudrait savoir si, et là il n'a pas donné son avis là-dessus, pour savoir si pour ou contre l'administration actuelle, mais il voudrait savoir si, une fois que l'administration partie détiendra plus de pouvoir, si les relations vont s'améliorer entre les États-Unis et l'ONU.
L'administration de...
La prochaine.
Ouais. So I was translating for my father-in-law. He wants to know, of course he didn't give his opinion on one side. He was for or against the current administration. He's a very journalist about it. But he wanted to know if, once the current administration leaves, will relations between the United States and the United Nations, will they improve?
Je crois que ça ne peut que s'arranger, de toute façon.
I think it can only improve anyway.
Mais il ne faut pas se faire d'illusions, parce que les administrations précédentes, Bill Clinton par exemple, menaient un combat avec les Nations Unies qui était plus soft, qui était plus sur la part, le financement par les États-Unis des Nations Unies. C'est-à-dire que l'administration américaine, c'est le Congrès, considère que les États-Unis paient beaucoup trop. Leur contribution est trop élevée.
It's important not to live on illusions. The former administration tried to... They paid too much?
Complained that they were paying too much.
They complained that they were paying too much.
Et l'administration précédente...
For a long while, they weren't paying anything.
Et alors que, donc pendant des années, les États-Unis ont fait, sous l'administration Clinton, ont fait un chantage en fait, en disant nous on va payer, mais il faut que l'ONU agisse comme ça, comme ça,
So
comme ça.
for
Comme
many
ça.
years, the UN, given the fact that they were giving money, it had to go their way because they were giving money. It's a sort of blackmailing.
Parce que en ce qui concerne les États-Unis, le problème vient souvent du Congrès, et non
As
pas
far
des
as
présidents.
the United States is concerned, the problem is more on the Congress side than on the president's side.
Et souvent, il y a des désaccords entre les présidents, et les congrès sur l'attitude à adopter vis-à-vis des Nations Unies. Parce que, pardon.
Often they don't agree on the attitude to adopt for the United Nations.
Parce que c'est le congrès, comme vous le savez, qui vote le budget, enfin qui débloque les fonds pour payer la cotisation en quelque sorte à l'ONU.
Because it's the Congress who manage the funds and the money was going to be given to the United Nations.
Et que beaucoup de sénateurs et de représentants considèrent qui n'ont pas une ouverture sur le monde, considèrent que ça ne sert à rien de payer une organisation comme les Nations Unies.
Many senators think there's no point in giving money to this organization.
Mais je pense que de toute façon, ça va s'améliorer. De toute façon, ça ne peut pas être pire qu'aujourd'hui.
But I think it will get better. There's no other way. It cannot be worse.
Parce que moi, vous vous souvenez sans doute de la nomination de John Bolton
You probably remember the nomination of John Bolton
comme représentant des États-Unis au Conseil de sécurité, qui disait que
as representing the United States in the Security Council.
Pendant la guerre en Irak, et qui disait que si on supprimait une partie de la tour du siège des Nations Unies, en fait, on ne verrait pas la différence pour le monde.
He was saying during
Pendant la
during
guerre.
the war that if we were taking off a part of the UN tower, no one would see the difference.
Donc, ça ne peut que s'améliorer.
It can only be better.
Mais c'est intéressant parce que le Congrès a refusé de confirmer la nomination de John Bolton.
But the Congress refused the nomination of John Bolton.
Et c'est George Bush qui a insisté pour le nommer.
And it's George Bush who insisted.
Et là, j'ai trouvé ça intéressant parce qu'il y avait là une division, une différence d'appréciation entre le George Bush, foncièrement anti-Nations Unies, et le Congrès qui, pour une fois, considérait que les choses allaient trop loin et qu'il fallait absolument pas nommer John Bolton, qui a fini par partir d'ailleurs.
So there was a big difference in the point of view of George Bush, who was anti-UN, and the Congress, who was supporting Bolton.
No.
Who was against it.
But the Democrats didn't have enough votes to keep him from being nominated. In fact, John Bolton was named during a recess of Congress. Because then
the Democrats didn't have any vote on it.
That's right. That's why they did. That's why the president did it, because when they were adjourned, he made the nomination, which could only be good for a year. It was only temporary. But then when it came up for permanent, it was not. He bowed out as well.
Do you believe in the independency of the UN one day?
Non, parce que voilà, il faut créer une autre organisation.
No, because we would have to create a different organization.
Parce que l'ONU, c'est une organisation qui accueille aujourd'hui 192 États.
There's 192 different countries in the UN.
Tous les pays du monde sauf Taïwan. Encore une fois, elle n'est pas indépendante.
All the countries except Taiwan, but it's not independent.
C'est une sorte de forum du monde.
It's like a world forum.
Peut-être qu'au siècle prochain, dans 2 siècles, l'ONU sera devenue un gouvernement du monde, je ne sais pas, avec l'Assemblée générale comme parlement et le Conseil de sécurité comme organe de décision.
Maybe in 1 or 2 centuries, the UN would have become a government of the world.
Do you believe the new French president, Sarkozy, would be less interested in the United Nations than his predecessor, Chirac?
Alors, comme journaliste, je crois que Chirac était plus intéressé par l'ONU que Sarkozy.
As a journalist, I think that Chirac was more interested in the United Nations than Sarkozy is.
Pas simplement parce qu'il y a eu l'histoire de l'Irak,
Not only because of Iraq,
Mais la diplomatie sous Chirac, c'était évidemment, tout devait passer par l'ONU.
But the diplomacy under Chirac was that everything should go through the UN.
C'est pour ça, tout à l'heure, que je dis que l'ONU, la France était presque le meilleur élève de l'ONU.
That's why I was saying that France was the best pupil student of the United Nations.
Mais je me demande si les choses ne sont pas en train de changer un petit peu, et si Nicolas Sarkozy n'a pas plutôt la tentation de revenir à des négociations entre États. Et par exemple, on en parlait aussi ce matin, pour l'Iran.
I'm wondering if things are not starting to change now, and if Sarkozy is not more willing to negotiate between the states.
Et pour l'Iran, par exemple, il ne m'étonnerait pas que Nicolas Sarkozy dise un jour qu'il faut prendre une décision sans l'ONU, par exemple.
For Iran, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if Nicolas Sarkozy would say that there's a decision that needs to be made even without the United Nations.
Et c'est un grand sujet de débat en France en ce moment, c'est l'attitude de Nicolas Sarkozy sur l'Iran, parce qu'il a des propos sur la guerre, sur le risque, comme Bernard Kouchner, le ministre des Affaires étrangères.
It's a big debate in France now, the attitude of Nicolas Sarkozy and of Bernard Kouchner over the Iran issue.
Et le grand débat porte aussi sur est-ce que Nicolas Sarkozy est plus proche des États-Unis que Jacques Chirac. Ça, c'est un
And the
débat.
other debate is that is Nicolas Sarkozy closer to the United States than Chirac was?
So what is your feeling?
Je crois que c'est vrai.
I think it's true.
Je crois que c'est vrai parce que nous, les journalistes à Paris, on dit que Nicolas Sarkozy, enfin nous les journalistes, je ne suis pas le porte-parole des journalistes non plus, mais quand on discute de ça, on sent une vraie fascination de Nicolas Sarkozy pour les États-Unis.
In France, the journalists that I know, we are saying that there's a real fascination for the United States for Nicolas Sarkozy.
Et cet été, il y a une photo qui a été publiée par tous les journaux. Il est allé en vacances dans le Maine.
There's a picture that was published in every newspaper about Sarkozy who had his holidays in the Maine.
Et on le voyait entre les deux présidents Bush, enfin le père et le fils,
It was between the two President Bush, father and son,
sur un superbe bateau.
on a very nice boat.
Et il était heureux.
He was happy.
Et, mais on sentait que c'était presque un rêve d'enfant qui se réalisait.
It was like a child dream who was becoming true.
Mais simplement, maintenant, il est président.
Now he's the president, not a child anymore.
You don't think that Nicolas Sarkozy might be even more interested by Nicolas Sarkozy than
Yes.
the United
Yeah.
States?
Je crois que oui, c'est vrai. Enfin bon, ça, je ne suis pas journaliste politique, mais...
It's a different topic.
Ouais.
Okay, well, I think we'll thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you,
Thank
Monsieur
you.
Neldik,
Thank you.
for being with us.